The streets of New Orleans in 1910. A small Sicilian boy, he steps off the boat into a world of that time of jazz, corruption, and opportunity. He knew no English, he had no money, he had no connections. At that time, America promised to every immigrant a shot at the dream. Well, Marcello, he turned his dream into a grip on the South. Over many decades, that grip stretched from Louisiana bayous to the Texas oil fields. While other bosses fought for control, Marcello figured it out. He figured how to buy it. And he had political connections, backroom deals, influence buried deep inside these southern institutions. He built an empire so well hidden, even the law struggled to prove it even ever existed. Now they called him, quote, the little man. But behind the scenes, his name carried more weight than most politicians at that time. And when a president was assassinated in Dallas, you know who? His name didn't make the front page, but it never left the conversation. So this is the story of a man who really understood power. He understood it better than anyone, and he used it to become basically untouchable. Hey everyone, welcome to another Sit Down with Michael Franzese. Hope everybody is doing well. All is good, very blessed on this end, my friends. And as always, I give all the praise, honor, glory, and thanksgiving to our God for that, because He deserves it. Today, as we continue in this series of, doing this documentary style video on all of the mobsters that you see in the back here on this beautiful tapestry and also on the canvas. Many of you have been buying the canvas. There's a link here. You've been asking me about it. You can go and get it. As we continue the series, today we're doing Carlos Marcello. Big guy in New Orleans, very prominent figure in this life, and a very, very interesting story. So I hope you enjoy it, and we're going to continue. We're doing 2 a month on this. Everybody's loving it. My editors are doing a great job. We're putting a lot of work into this. And again, this is history, people. We're not glorifying the life. We're not glorifying the people. I keep telling everybody, I walked away from the life. There was a reason for that. We're not, not going to get into that again, but, it's history. It's part of American culture. There's no doubt about it. Over the past 100 years, the Mafia, Cosa Nostra, had a big influence in this country, so we're talking history. That's what it's all about. But you people are all loving it, and I appreciate it very much. The comments are so great, and it's really very satisfying, gratifying, I should say, when we put work and effort into a piece and people come back and they've been so kind and really so nice in complimenting us on it. So we really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And we're here to entertain you, to inform you, to give you good content. That's what it's all about. And me and my team, we take it very seriously. So here we go. Now you may ask, why Carlos Marcello? Well, you're going to find out why. The guy had a lot of influence. He was really the most powerful man in the South, and he'd been hiding all along in plain sight. I mean, he was there, but he just knew how to cover his operation. And people, before I get into this, I got to take a sip of my wine. A lot of you love the pomegranate wine that we had, the bottle that it's in. It's beautiful. Well, we now have a blackberry wine, same thing in a blackberry bottle, and it's terrific. I actually like it a little bit more than the pomegranate. Pomegranate's a little bit tart. People that love pomegranate, they love the pomegranate wine. It's flying off the shelves. I think this could do even better. It's blackberry, it's terrific, gets me, started and get me rolling. I only drink wine, maybe I have a glass during the day, sometimes, not all the time. At night with my meal, most of the times I have a glass. So salud. I'm telling you people, this blackberry wine is good. You're gonna love it. Calogero Minacori, that was his name before he changed it to Marcello. He was born in Tunisia. His parents were Sicilian, and they arrived in New Orleans in 1910. He was 8 years old. He didn't speak English. His family found not the American dream, but really the harsh reality of immigrant life in early 20th century Louisiana. It was tough. There was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of prejudice, and there were limited opportunities in a city where for some reason Italians were viewed with a lot of suspicion. Now school wasn't an option for him for very long. By his early teens, he was working the docks. He was learning the streets. He was actually running errands for some of the local gangsters. He was keeping lookout for them. He was making good connections. And this was a time before Prohibition, where Italian criminals, they were still finding their place in American underworld. Even as a teenager, Marcello, as he would later rename himself, he had something I would say was very rare back then. He had patience, he had intelligence, and most importantly, he was a very disciplined guy. While other gangsters sought quick profits, Marcello, he was observing everything. He was learning who held real power. And he noticed how the loudest gangsters, they often died the fastest in people. I'm telling you, I saw that in my own experience on the streets. The guys who bullied their way, who were bragging, who were the first to pull the trigger on somebody, they didn't last. Because why do you want to deal with somebody like that? They're loose cannons. You know, you want to talk and brag about things. You want to be the first to, pull the trigger on somebody. You don't last. People want to get rid of you. You know, in the beginning, maybe you got, somewhat of a run, but in the end, the Roy DeMeos, people like that, they don't live a long life when you're acting like that. Doesn't work. Marcello, by the age of 18, he had begun building relationships that would honestly serve him for decades. Not just with other criminals, but with politicians, with police officers, and even with businessmen. He recognized early on that real power in the South, it worked differently than in New York or Chicago. Here in Louisiana, it was all about relationships. It was about family connections and an understanding of the region's complex racial and social hierarchy. By his early 20s, now Carlos Marcello, he was making steady money in bootlegging. That was during Prohibition. He had gambling operations, and in Louisiana, he had the seafood business, very lucrative. But really what separated him from countless other ambitious young criminals was his extraordinary patience. He didn't need to be known as the boss. He preferred to be the power behind the throne, the man whose name was whispered rather than shouted. And people, I'm telling you again, Carlo Gambino, Tony Accardo in Chicago, the guys that laid low, these were the guys that held the real power. They didn't want to be on Front Street. They didn't want to make the headlines. They wanted to be quiet. They lived a different lifestyle, and those are the ones that lasted. Accardo ran his family like I did, and I talked about it in a video that I did, for over 40 years. Carlo Gambino, 20 years, didn't do any prison time. You gotta maintain a low profile in that life. The John Gottis, the Joe Colombos, they just don't last. Carlos Marcello, he had the right idea. My friends, in my former life, we really looked out for each other. If someone was suspicious in the neighborhood, word got around very fast. But these days, let me tell you, these companies, they sit on data breaches for months while criminals are walking off with your entire life. Just recently, Bank of America had another data breach, and they kept silent about it for months. In my world, we call that omerta, but at least we had a code. These companies, they wait an average of 277 days before telling you about a data breach. That's 9 months that these criminals have with your data. Look, with cyber attacks happening daily, your personal information is probably already at risk. That's why I personally use Aura. After rebuilding my life post-prison, I'm not letting some faceless hacker take what I've worked so hard for. Aura alerts me immediately if any of my information is on the dark web, or if someone is trying to access my accounts, my social security number, or even my emails. Plus, they back it up with $5 million in identity theft insurance. These companies that offer free credit monitoring after a breach, that's like my neighbor calling to tell me someone stole my car yesterday. Thanks for the heads up, my friend. Family is everything to me, people, so go to aura.com/Franzese for 2 weeks free service. They'll find out if your data is already exposed before these companies are forced to tell you, and that's 9 months later. Remember this, it's better to have protection and not need it than to need protection and not have it. The era of Prohibition, it really transformed crime all across America. I've said it many times. It was the government that made the mob strong in America, because when they created that vacuum, when people wanted alcohol and you couldn't get it legitimately, the mob steps in, they provide it, speakeasies all over the country, and what happens? They make millions. When you got money, that's when power comes. When you got organization, it's all fueled by the money. That's it. Prohibition did it. There was fortunes made in illegal alcohol. In New Orleans, with its tradition of drinking and celebration, you know what it's known for? Bootlegging became enormously profitable. The city's location made it perfect for smuggling liquor from the Caribbean and Mexico. Marcello's worked within the organization of Frank Costello. Frank Costello was his boss, as Lucky Luciano's representative in New Orleans. He studied how these New York figures operated, but adapted their methods to the unique culture of Louisiana. You gotta be adaptable. Louisiana is different. I know from my experience down there, they still have a mob presence down there. A lot of relationships, it's a town built upon relationships, New Orleans is. While New York had its 5 families and Chicago had its outfit, New Orleans would have something very different. A single, unified operation with Marcello's eventually at its center. By 1930, Marcello had developed a distinctive approach to criminal business. He rarely spoke directly about illegal activities. He met associates in his working-class restaurant rather than flashy nightclubs. He kept no records, so important. He avoided telephones. My dad used to tell me, "You see this?" And he would hold the phone. He said, "This is a cop. Be careful. Don't ever talk. It's a cop." And he was right. And as a result, I never was caught on any kind of surveillance, mechanism that got me in trouble. And that was thanks to my dad. So he kept no records, Marcello. He avoided telephones. Again, he conducted business through trusted intermediaries. But most important, he built an unprecedented network of corruption within Louisiana's political system. Very corrupt, something like Chicago. This wasn't just about bribing individuals. Marcello understood Louisiana's unique political culture, where relationships and favors often mattered more than ideology or law. He inserted himself into the intricate web of parish politics, courthouse relationships, and the personal connections that really governed the state. By his early 30s, Marcello controlled very significant gambling operations throughout the entire state of Louisiana. His slot machines, they appeared in businesses across the state. His bookmaking operation was very sophisticated and very profitable. He had interest in restaurants, real estate, transportation companies. Unlike the flashier gangsters who sought publicity, Marcello again cultivated anonymity. He didn't want anybody to know who he was. He lived modestly, a middle-class neighborhood. He dressed very conservatively. He spoke very little in public. While other mob figures made headlines, Marcello made money, and he achieved real power in that state and across the country. This low profile served him very well when a series of gangland shootings and killings in New York shook New Orleans in the late 1930s. As rivals eliminated each other, Marcello emerged unscathed and stronger than ever. He consolidated control without becoming a target himself. And actually, by 1940, at just 30 years old, Carlos Marcello had positioned himself to become what no one else had ever achieved. He was the absolute boss of New Orleans crime, a position he would hold with really remarkable stability for decades. I love this blackberry. All right, so now we're post-World War II, and Marcello, he really started to accelerate his rise. Other criminal organizations, they faced very intensive federal scrutiny, but Marcello's operation remained pretty well untouched. It was protected by his extraordinary security measures and his very deep political connections. His gambling empire expanded dramatically with wire services for bookmaking. He really created that system. Illegal casinos, slot machines, generating millions of dollars annually. He controlled vice operations throughout the entire state. And actually through parts of Texas also. His loan sharking operation extended credit to everyone, from poor laborers to wealthy businessmen. What truly set Marcello apart was his business approach. He really diversified into legitimate enterprises. He had restaurants, he had real estate developments, he had transportation companies, and he was in the seafood industry, again, very lucrative in Louisiana. The line between his illegal and his legal operations became deliberately blurred, making prosecution of him nearly impossible. Marcello established his headquarters at the Town and Country Motel in Metairie, outside New Orleans. From a small office there, he conducted his business every day. He met with associates who would wait hours for just 5 minutes of his time. He never discussed illegal activities directly. He never put anything in writing. If something needed to be said, it was whispered in person, often while walking outside where no recording devices could capture his words. How often my dad and I would, at times, my dad would go into the bathroom of our house. He would turn on the faucets and it would make me tilt my head close to the faucet in case the house or the room was bugged. It would be muffled, our conversation, by the water running out of the faucet. It was crazy. We would go outside, we would walk down the street, we'd cover our faces, just like, if you follow baseball, whenever a pitcher and a catcher, or whenever they're talking, when they approach the mound, they always got their glove over their face because they don't want anybody reading what they have to say about what the next pitch or the next strategy is going to be with the next batter up. It's unbelievable. That's what we did, and that's what Carlos Marcello did. His political influence became very extraordinary. He had judges, he had police officials, he had state legislators, and even governors. They found it very beneficial to maintain relationship with Marcello's network. In return for campaign contributions and his support, they ensured Marcello's operations remained protected. That happens to a degree even till today. By the early 1950s, Marcello's organization generated tens of millions of dollars in today's dollars. He had transformed organized crime in the South from, I would say, scattered operations into a very sophisticated network with himself as the quiet center. He controlled the unions. He influenced construction contracts. He had a hand in virtually every significant economic development in the entire city of New Orleans. For an immigrant to arrive with nothing, it was a remarkable achievement, a criminal empire built not on violence and headlines. And look, you got to give the guy credit. He came here with nothing, and even though it was a criminal organization that he was involved in, he nurtured a lot of relationships. He had politicians eating out of his hand. He had the police. You got to give a guy credit like that, even though it was an illegal activity. He built an empire, But as Marcello's power grew, he would finally attract some unwanted attention. Senator Estes Kefauver's crime committee hearings in 1950 and 51 brought him very briefly into the national spotlight, and a young Justice Department attorney named, who else? Robert Kennedy. He had begun to take notice of the quiet man in New Orleans. It was the Kefauver hearings that marked Marcello's first significant public exposure. He was called to testify in January 1951, and of course he repeatedly invoked the Fifth Amendment. He refused to answer questions about his activities. His performance was a study in restraint, no dramatic outbursts, just quiet, composed denials. The hearings identified him as a major crime figure, but Marcello returned to New Orleans seemingly untouched. They didn't do anything to him. His power was intact. Again, these hearings in front of the Senate, they're nothing more than show. They're not criminal investigations. Nobody gets indicted because of them. They're really a dog and pony show for the public. That's it. They don't do much more. And I've said that time and time again. The publicity, however, it placed them on the federal government's radar permanently, and that's what it does. Okay, you get publicity, so now the FBI starts to watch you. That's about it. And of course that's damaging, but nothing comes out of the hearings itself other than now you're exposed. In 1953, the government discovered Marcello had falsely claimed American birth and was actually Tunisian by birth. Immigration authorities moved to deport him. But through legal maneuvers and political influence that he had, Marcello delayed the process for years. Despite these challenges, his criminal empire just continued expanding, and that was throughout all of the 1950s. He established connections with Dallas criminals, including Jack Ruby. Remember that now. I've talked about this quite a bit in the past couple of months when we talked about the classified documents on the Kennedy assassination being revealed. Dallas criminals, Jack Ruby, yes, he knew Carlos Marcello, without a doubt. And he extended his operations into parts of Texas, and he developed a relationship with casino interests in Las Vegas, where he was a hidden investor. Again, it was the mob that built Las Vegas. You can't take away anything from the mob when it comes to Las Vegas. Marcello was a key figure. Carter was a key figure. Some guys from New York, some guys from Cleveland. They built Las Vegas, and Marcello was in the middle of that. He maintained very strong connections to the National Commission, and that was established by Luciano, as we know, especially figures like Santo Trafficante Jr. in Tampa. We don't talk much about him, but we'll get into him. I'm going to do a video. He's a very interesting guy, again, a very powerful guy, and him and Marcello are very close. These relationships ensured his operations integrated with the national syndicate while maintaining independence. Now, unlike other mob bosses, Marcello was rarely photographed. He avoided public appearances. He lived in a substantial but not an ostentatious home in Metairie. His family life remained private and traditional. He donated to charities very quietly. To neighbors, he appeared to be simply a successful businessman. This carefully constructed image was threatened when Robert Kennedy became Attorney General in 1961. Unlike previous federal officials, Kennedy viewed Marcello as a primary target, believing that removing him would significantly damage organized crime in the South, and he was right. What follows was an extraordinary confrontation. In April 1961, Marcello was arrested without warning. He was transported to Guatemala and unceremoniously dropped there without any proper documentation. A deportation of unprecedented harshness, personally overseen by Robert Kennedy. Yeah, Kennedy did that. He picked him up out of nowhere, brought him to Guatemala, and just dropped him in a forest. That was it. For most crime bosses, such treatment would have meant the end, but not Marcello. He had prepared for this possibility. Within weeks, he had returned to the United States through a complex and very complex route involving multiple countries and false documentation. By the summer, he was back in his office at the Town and Country Motel. His determination to survive was now reinforced by a very deep hatred for the Kennedy brothers. Remember that, a hatred for the Kennedy brothers. Ricardo had a hatred. Marcello had a hatred. We all hated him. When I say we, of course, these were people before my time, but they hated him for many, many reasons. Not only for Robert Kennedy, but because what Joe Kennedy did. He promised that we would have access to the White House. He promised Robert F. Kennedy would back off if we delivered the election to him. Nixon, Kennedy, we did that, and they totally reneged on their promise. The failed deportation attempt, that only strengthened Marcello's resolve. He tightened his security, he deepened his political connections, and he became even more cautious in his operations. The battle lines were drawn between the quiet town of New Orleans and the Kennedy Justice Department. Now let me tell you, despite Kennedy's efforts, Robert Kennedy that is, Marcello not only survived, he thrived during the early 1960s. His gambling operations, they were modernized. His real estate investments multiplied. His control of labor unions solidified. His political influence remained intact despite the federal pressure. Not everybody in New Orleans loved the feds, trust me on that. In private, Marcello was reportedly he was furious about Kennedy's deportation attempt. Allegedly, he made threats against the president. Whether these threats were serious or simply venting remains one of the most contested questions really in American criminal history. But I have the answers. I've said them before, Piers Morgan, I've talked about it. I'll take it to my grave based upon the information that I have from knowledgeable people, people in the know. Without a doubt, the Kennedy assassination was fueled by the mob. On November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. And though official investigations identified Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone gunman, questions about possible Marcello involvement have persisted for decades. Oswald had New Orleans connections, absolutely, and Jack Ruby, who killed Oswald, had ties to Marcello associates, no doubt about it, as well as ties to those people in Chicago, going back to Al Capone. Ricardo, of course, no doubt about it. No concrete evidence has ever linked Marcello to the assassination. He consistently denied any involvement. But the coincidence of Kennedy's death occurring in Dallas, part of Marcello's extended territory, after his brother's aggressive pursuit of Marcello, has fueled endless speculation, and I cleared that up. No doubt about it. The mob was involved in that hit, Kennedy's hit. What's undeniable is that after the assassination, pressure on Marcello, it decreased significantly. The remainder of the 1960s, his power peaked. He expanded operations into new territories in Louisiana and outside of Louisiana. His investments in Las Vegas casinos, they increased through frontmen. And he developed a very sophisticated money laundering operation through offshore banking. Marcello operated with remarkable discipline. He maintained regular hours at his town and country office. He kept no incriminating records. He spoke in coded language, even with his associates. His organizational structure remained informal but very effective, based upon personal loyalty rather than formal hierarchy. By the early 1970s, Marcello's legitimate holdings had grown really extraordinary. His commercial real estate throughout Louisiana was huge. His restaurant chains, huge. Transportation companies and extensive land holdings, they were all huge. His criminal operations remained protected by a network of very corrupt officials and his own exceptional security consciousness. For a time, it seemed like Marcello had achieved something that was very unique in American criminal history, a virtually untouchable position. The federal government knew what he was doing, but they struggled to develop any kind of prosecutable case against him. Local law enforcement was largely ineffective against his influence. His operation ran with remarkable efficiency and really very minimal violence. But no power, however carefully constructed, lasts forever. As the 1970s progressed, new federal strategies and changing social conditions would finally begin to threaten Marcello's very carefully built empire. All right, so now we're into the 1970s, and honestly, they brought new challenges to Marcello's operation. His traditional gambling became less profitable as states started to legalize various forms of betting. Labor racketeering faced increased federal scrutiny. Younger criminals were, I would say, less disciplined. They were harder to control. More significantly, the federal government developed new investigative approaches. We know what that was. The RICO statute, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors tools specifically designed to target organized crime networks. We know all about that. I've spoken about that. I was a victim of that. 3 racketeering cases, very effective in going after organized crime. I've said this many times. It wasn't John Gotti or any one person that took the mob down. It was the RICO statute. Electronic surveillance became much more sophisticated. The FBI shifted resources towards organized crime investigations away from other things they were doing. In 1979, the FBI launched Operation Brylab, an elaborate sting operation targeting labor racketeering and political corruption in Louisiana. Using an undercover agent posing as an insurance executive, they recorded many conversations with various Louisiana figures, eventually including Marcello himself. On June 17, 1980, after decades of avoiding prosecution, Marcello was finally indicted on conspiracy and fraud charges. Now he was in his 70s. He was facing very serious federal charges for the first time in his life. He made it to his 70s. The quiet Don, though, he maintained his composure. He appeared in court impeccably dressed. He showed no emotions as proceedings unfolded. The trial lasted 2 months, featured recordings where Marcello did discuss influencing union insurance contracts. On March 31st, 1981, the jury found him guilty. Appeals followed, but his conviction was upheld, and in 1983, Marcello began serving a 7-year sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Texarkana, Texas. Even as he went to prison, a second case developed. Operation Mongoose targeted Marcello and Chicago boss Tony Accardo for attempting to bribe a judge in an earlier case. In 1983, Marcello was convicted in that case as well. He received an additional 10-year prison sentence. At 73, Marcello entered prison, a shocking fall for a man who had operated really with apparent impunity for decades. His health deteriorated rapidly in confinement. He suffered strokes, showed signs of dementia. His once formidable memory and mental sharpness, it faded. Outside, his organization began fracturing with his leadership gone. Family members and associates struggled to maintain control. Federal prosecutions of remaining leadership, they really accelerated the decline of his empire. And by the late 1980s, the criminal empire Marcello had built was really largely dismantled. In 1989, Marcello was released from prison due to his very deteriorating health. He returned to his home in Metairie, but the man who came back was really totally diminished. He was physically weak, mentally confused. He required, unfortunately, constant care. The mind that had outsmarted federal authorities for decades was now failing him, leaving him confused and dependent on people around him in his final years. It was very sad. March 2nd, 1993, a nursing home in Metairie, Louisiana. Carlos Marcello, once the most powerful crime figure in the South, he dies at 83 after years of declining health. The man who had controlled gambling, vice, and corruption across all of Louisiana, he passed away very quietly, his death making only modest headlines. You know, it's really something. Some people in power who have so much power and control for years, you know, when you're in an illegal operation like that, when you die, you know, most of the times it's just quiet. I mean, some of these people have had ornate funerals. I know John Gotti did. But for others, it's just quiet. And his funeral at St. Bernard Memorial Garden was attended by family, remaining associates, and some curious onlookers. No dramatic scenes of gangland figures paying respects. You know, a lot of times you don't want to go to those funerals if you're a made guy, if you're a guy in that life, because then the FBI is outside, they're taking pictures, and all of a sudden you're on blast. You know, but it was a relatively modest service for a man whose power had been largely forgotten by a new generation. What he built largely died with him, I guess. The organization he created didn't survive intact after his imprisonment. As traditional organized crime declined nationally in the 1990s after the RICO statute wreaked havoc, Marcello's remaining structure collapsed completely. It was replaced by a looser criminal network without the same central authority. Yet Marcello's influence, it persisted in more subtle ways. The corruption networks he established within Louisiana politics, well, that outlived him until today. It contributed to the state's continuing struggles with governance. Until today, they still struggle. His money laundering techniques provided templates that are still used by criminal organizations today in Louisiana. His strategy of diversifying into legitimate businesses while maintaining criminal operations, it influenced organized crime evolution internationally. There's a darker legacy too. Persistent questions about whether Marcello played some role in the Kennedy assassination. You know, historians and researchers continued debating his possible involvement with definitive answers likely impossible after so many years. I gave you the definitive answers. There's no question that we, Mafia, had a hand in the JFK assassination. No question. Carlos Marcello didn't just adapt to America. He exploited its weaknesses. He identified its pressure points. He built a criminal empire uniquely suited to the culture and politics of the American South. History isn't just made by those who seek the spotlight. Sometimes it's shaped by those who very deliberately avoid it. Men like Carlos Marcello, who changed the region without most of its citizens ever really knowing his name. People, sometimes the past, it casts very long shadows. Carlos Marcello died nearly 30 years ago, but his influence continues echoing throughout the South, and I know that. And in most ways, people don't even recognize. I have a lot of friends in the New Orleans area, and they tell me all the time, there's still a big influence there. Carlos has some relatives there too. When federal prosecutions really dismantled the last vestiges of Carlos Marcello's organization in the 1990s, many believed his brand of organized crime had disappeared completely. But systems this deeply embedded, they don't vanish. They absolutely transform. Look at Louisiana politics today. It's still struggling with corruption. It's still grappling with influence networks that blur the lines between business, politics, and crime. The specific individuals, they have changed, but the pathways Marcello established, they remain partially intact. Modern criminal organizations still follow aspects of his blueprint: political influence over flashy displays, patience over immediate profits, legitimate business as both cover and investment. Even the relationships between developers and government in New Orleans, they still reflect the patterns that he established. The immigrant boy who stepped off the boat in 1910 built something that outlasted him for sure. Not just a criminal organization, but an approach to power that showed how America's democratic institutions could be manipulated from within, how visibility isn't necessary for control, and how patience often trumps force. The quiet dawn is gone, but the shadows remain. Carlos Marcello's legacy, trust me, it lives on in the South until today. My friends, if you enjoyed this video, I'm going to give you an opportunity to become my partner in business. Franzese Wine experiencing tremendous growth over the past couple of years, and we're going to experience even further growth in the next few years. You're going to have an opportunity to be my partner because you've been supporting me, you've been my fan base, and I want to share this with you. So go to invest.franzesewine.com, and offer you shouldn't refuse.